Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening, listeners, and welcome to the Dark Matters radio show. I'm the Sorceress Cagliastro, blood sorceress necromancer in the hands of 9, and I am privileged to be on the air with my co-host, Chris Ostrowski, and our producer and science officer, this is my new term, Morgan St. Knight. I wanted to throw that at you, Morgan. See how that
Well, thank you.
Tonight we're going to be discussing the Disincarnate amongst us. And before we begin, I want to say a few words about what it means to be in service to the Disincarnate. I take the work very seriously, as does my co-host and as does Morgan, and those who are involved in this work, both with me and in their own way. And it is a requirement in my life that those who represent themselves as individuals involved with the Disincarnate show the appropriate respect and understand that these are individuals who were formerly living and who now are evolved into this new experience called being disincarnate, what some people call having transferred themselves through the death process, what others refer to as just simply being dead. And for want of the lack of want of spending an hour trying to decipher which part of that language is appropriate, in all due respect for the Disincarnate, let's use what we're comfortable with, and let's get some conversation going. For me, necromancy is perhaps the most extraordinary privilege, the biggest part of my work, the part that reminds me every day that the humanity of this work is something that goes on indefinitely. Some of the questions that we're going to be looking at tonight is why some see them and some don't, why some of us see them partially, why some of us see them fully, some of us hear them. Any manner of communication is different between ourselves and those who have been here before us and moved on to becoming disincarnate. And what we're really going to be looking at tonight is some of the science around this thing, because those of you who are familiar with my work know that there are no divinities or deities of any kind in my work. That's speaking only for myself, not for anyone else that I'm on the air with or that any of my listeners or students. They all have their own choices and beliefs. However, because I have this commitment to seeing it this way, as I'm a person who lives experientially, I am fascinated by and therefore required to observe the science of the thing. The science of sorcery is a science of looking at the physics, at what things might be made of, how they exist, being open to new scientific discoveries and how they can be utilized in our work, and not separating ourselves from the scientific community because we are thought of perhaps by them as fringe. We have a broader gaze. And with that, I'd like to pass on to Chris and say good evening to you. Chris, how are you tonight?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. What do you think about this subject?
Well, I do most of my work with people as they're transferring into becoming the disincarnate. So I'm at the beginning of this experience for them. It's kind of like I'm at the end of one and at the beginning of another. And I see a lot of questioning when they get to that point. You have on this side before they go, you see a lot of doubt, some apprehension, the feeling of not having completed things, having to stay because family members and all that. And when it finally happens and they make their way over, then there's a little bit of confusion on that side too, because they find out it's not what they expected. People expect things because of religions tell you that this is going to happen. There's going to be pearly gates of big white light and all this other kind of nonsense, and it's not there. I had an experience when I was going on 5 years old where I fell down a flight of cellar steps, and I was outside of my body. I can't say I was disincarnate, but I was outside, and I was looking down at myself, laying at the bottom of the steps. And let me tell you, there was nothing there. I didn't see a white light. I didn't see anything. I saw a different version of what I see now. So I understand a little bit of where they're going and how they feel when they get there, because it's not what they expected. Some people adjust, some people don't. I've had relatives that passed, and it's been years, and I still can't find them. I think it's because they don't know where to go. They're kind of stuck. And I do that sometimes for people. I try to find where somebody is.
Chris, do you think that all of them want to be found?
I have the ones I've dealt with. Yes, it's kind of like going into a maze. If you can think of a labyrinth for a minute, and you're not sure where to go, so you start going down this way. Well, next thing you know, you're in front of a wall. Okay, now what do you do? And I believe that's what happens to some of these people, is they get to that point where they hit that wall and don't know where to go from there.
I think that tonight we should spend some time talking about that and why some of them are available and why some of them are not. So if you can hold that for a second, I'd like to hear Morgan's thoughts about the subject, just to warm us all up for the evening. Morgan?
Hi. Yeah, this has been a subject that I've been really interested in as part of my studies, mostly because we're all going to end up on that side of the street one day. So I'd kind of like to know what to expect and who to expect to see there. I'm pretty sure now that I'm not going to see some guy in red long johns with a pitchfork, or hopefully not. And you know, if I do, I doubt it will actually be the devil. It will probably be just one of my crazy relatives. I'm sorry?
That'll be me. I'm sorry. I just want to do that as a joke.
That'll be you. That'll be you, Chris.
Relatives.
Yeah.
But you know, I have had experiences seeing dead people, and sometimes it's been very disorienting. In fact, just this past autumn, when I started working with you more directly, Sorceress, and you helped me with this, I had problems where dead people were popping up as I was driving along. And you helped me to adjust that and to close what was going on there. Because while I do want to be open to the dead, I do want to be open to the disincarnate and to be able to help them, I'm not yet in a space where I'm ready to see them 24/7. Just the idea that I could be engaged in, I don't know, the best sex of my life, and suddenly I see my great Aunt Mary sitting over my bed, waving her rosary at my face. That's just something I don't think I'm ready for just yet. So,
but Morgan, if that happens, will you call me? Because I'd really like to hear how that went.
I will. Well, I can tell you how it's going to go. Great Aunt Mary's going to get booted out on her little keister. But, you know,
you'll see that on Ghost Hunter.
But in all seriousness, I've tried to help people who are getting ready to transition. I've not yet been there when I've had people actually going through the transition and dying in front of me. That always seems to happen, and it's not any avoidance on my part. It always seems to happen when I'm not there. But I've been trying to work with people just to help them get there and help them understand what they might find based on my experiences of what I've seen and to the disincarnate that I have been able to communicate with.
You know, Morgan, to your point about which portals are open and which are closed and how that works, I live in a situation where I see them all the time. I'm looking at them right now. And sometimes when I'm driving, I have to do a double take and say to whoever I'm in the car with, most likely my daughter, do you see that? And she'll say yes or no. And a yes from her does not necessarily mean that it is a living person either, because she has seen quite a bit of the ones that I see. So there is this ongoing issue with how much of your life do you want to live amongst the dead. And for me, that is pretty much all the time. I don't even really comment on it most of the time anymore because it's just everywhere and all the time. I just want to, there's a story I've told before, and to Chris's point about what's there in the afterlife, if you want to use that term afterlife, the idea that one is living this life for some sort of doctrine that allows one to, or doesn't allow one to live a certain way based on some ideology or some doctrine that says that if you live a certain way, you get a certain present when you transition to being amongst the disincarnate. There was a period of time where there was someone dressed as a nun who was disincarnate. And for months and months and months, all I saw her do was be on her knees and crying. And she could tell that I could see her. There was definitely an interaction between us. I said nothing. It seemed to be a private moment that I was privy to. And this went on for quite some time, I would say more than half a year. And at one point I just said to her, okay, I don't know if you're in a loop or if this is ongoing. If it's ongoing, perhaps it's even worse. Why are you crying? And she said something, and I'm paraphrasing, of course. She said something like, I lived my whole life waiting for this heaven experience, and it didn't happen. And I only spoke to her one or two more times after that. She chose to not be present to communicate with as shortly after that. But the sorrow was so extreme. And I thought to myself, this is a woman who apparently, by her garb, I assume, chose to live a life of a certain manner in which one lives by doctrine and doesn't have a life of a broader view. And here she is in the afterlife, or in this aftermath of this crisis, and not getting paid. And I tell this story as often as I can because it's something that happened, it's something I saw, it's something I experienced for months and months, and it's something that a previously living human being made clear to me that this was her state of immense sorrow and disappointment. So this kind of thing, when it happens, is quite profound. And it occurred to me that there is, in my work, in my face of this thing, in the presence that I have in it, I have given up the right to close any portals. So I live a certain way where I have to be around those individuals. And your point, Morgan, although it was presented in a way that we all got to take a little laugh on it, is the way that life is for me. You know, they can be here. They're here all the time. It is my attending demons that stop the madness on occasion and hold back the crowd. And one of the things that I want to talk about tonight is why some of us see them and some of us don't. Any thoughts on any of that?
I think it has to do with as far as how far we're open in our mind. Like I said, I was young when that happened to me, and I don't think I ever got out of the invisible friend stage, if you want to call it that. Mm-hmm. I've always believed in that, that there was something else that you could see, because I would see things that nobody else saw. And, people would think I was crazy, I mean, I lived near a cemetery. I could literally walk 3 blocks and I was standing in the middle of a cemetery. And I would spend some time, with there as a kid, first as a morbid curiosity. But it got to the point then that I could see things. I would notice people walking around there. And even though people would tell me I'm nuts, and no, you don't see that, I never stopped believing that. So I never...
Well, that's not a belief. That's proof. That's data. That's what your eyes are showing you.
But I never got to that point where I'm crazy. I don't see that. I didn't do that. I never doubted what I'm seeing with my eyes. And I think that has a lot to do with it. If you don't let yourself be in tune with what's going on around you, you're not going to see it. It's the same as if you walk through the woods and you can feel different things in the woods. I do work with herbs and things like that, and when I go through forest or trees or something like that, you can just feel certain things when you get near the trees. You can tell when a tree's old because of the energy that comes off of it. Mm-hmm. And I think it's the same way when you're dealing with a disincarnate. You have to be open to that. You have to let yourself be open to it. And you've got to be on that level to think and see what's going on. So many people can't even see the people that's around them, let alone anything else.
Well, there's a lot of reasons, I think, that some of us see them and some of us don't, and the quantity that we see or the type of individual that we see and the clarity with which we see them. And Morgan's going to offer us some science on that. But I want to first say that I think it has a lot to do with, like you're saying, Chris, our willingness to be part of the entire human experience as opposed to the part that happens at this end. I have an idea that, and I guess later when we're talking more about science, I'll get more into this, but I have an idea that the experience of becoming disincarnate is part of the evolution of the human experience. So that when one is there in that place, post the physical attachment, and I'm not even sure that it is post a physical attachment because we're going to talk about what we think the disincarnate might be made of, just as we talk about what we're made of, that there is a sense of having proceeded in the evolution of the experience. What they show us is just what any human being shows us. I've said a million times that the disincarnate become more of who they are because they are living without boundaries and have a broader gaze. If you are a happy-go-lucky type of person, and as a living human being, you're even happier and have an even more joyful, if you will, outlook of the bigger picture as a member of the disincarnate once settled into that role. If you are a hostile, nasty individual, then you will be a more hostile, nasty individual. And as necromancers on this side, we can look at those proclivities and utilize them thusly. But I think that it is really an evolution of the human form to become disincarnate. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. I mean, we know our body is going to give out eventually. We know that something is going to happen to prevent this physical vessel that we're in right now, this physical form, to prevent it from continuing on. And yet there is so much evidence, anecdotal and otherwise, that something of us does continue on beyond this, that we are somehow more than just this physical shell, that it really does make sense to me that it is part of our evolution and part of the path that we're all supposed to take. And I like the term evolution because it removes a lot of the gobbledygook that we get from spirituality and that sometimes. I'm not trying to degrade religion. I have great respect for most of the world's religions, but I do think that evolution is a science. And right now, we have enough science to tell us basically where humans have come from. We know there are some missing links, so to speak. There's more than one missing link. There's not really a direct line of evolution that we can point to that's totally unbroken. It's mostly unbroken, but not totally. But at the point in science development now where we're just now beginning to understand how the quantum world works, how things work on entirely different energy levels, I think it's only a matter of time before we develop what most people would call the hard science to actually examine the evolution that takes place with human beings after the body gives out. And I think that will happen one day.
I'm interested in the science of the thing, and as everyone who knows me knows that what's coming up this autumn is the Blood Project. It is my desire to create an environment where one sits in a chair and faces another chair, and that is the sort of baseline of the thing. And in the other chair, we present an opportunity for the disincarnate that this individual wants to speak to come and be spoken to. The high-frequency aspect of it is that it will be able to be seen by spectators. And to do that, one has to understand that the disincarnate have form and matter. One does not necessarily have to know what the form and matter is. And that is, I think, what separates necromancers from scientists in a way, is that I am willing to have an experience with a successful outcome without absolutely demanding to know the nuts and bolts. Because the nuts and bolts, the more comfortable we become with them, the more information presents itself. And that is really what the Blood Project is. I'm going to use the blood of 100 or so volunteers and and very, very heavy magnets, and pretty much as a lure, a bait, if you will, to the experience of being alive. And in that sense, I will be able to make an option for people to be able to communicate with an individual that what they desire to communicate with, live and in person, if you will. I think that the science will show up from there. What do you think?
It will be an amazing starting point. Yeah, it'll be a perfect place to start, because you're starting with something that is a very scientifically sound, a basic premise, and you're going about trying to gather the data and fill in the blanks, and you've got a process down. It's not just some haphazard thing, so I think that's a really good jumping off point.
Yeah, it's really very heavily focused in the science of the thing, and in that sense I want to try very hard to not lose the humanity of the thing. I mean, Chris, you often talk about what it feels like to experience a disincarnate. You use the term feels like a lot. Tell us about that.
When it happened to me, and I was there, I didn't feel like I do now. I was rather light. I sensed more than I saw around me. Mm-hmm. It was like 360 degrees of knowing everything that was around me, but I could focus to the front or wherever if I needed to. Is that it didn't last long. Maybe 10, 15 seconds. I don't know. But then again, time has when you're like that, there is no time.
Right, of course.
Now, as far as the people that I've dealt with, I've had a big array of emotions that have gone through that. I've had people that have had guilt. I've had people that were happy, that felt good. Some were still worried on the other side when they were worried about their relatives. You know, was any business not completed? People that were in pain. It comes to mind my one friend that had lung cancer. When she passed, it was almost like a surprise party. When
How so?
She got to the other side, that's how she felt, because there was no pain anymore. I think some that go to that point find out that there is no pearly gates and all that stuff, and they find out there is no end, because if you look at the religions, everything has an end there. You always end up someplace. If this is an evolutionary process, I believe that the ones that are intelligent go past that and want to see what's further.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you.
What's beyond being disincarnate? Where do you go from there? And we have
That's
so
very
much. Right, and we have so much that just deals with, okay, you you die, and this is what happens. Well, what happens after that? You know, if we go from being human to being a spirit, what's the next process? There has to be another process. To me, it just doesn't end. Nothing ends. It changes, especially energy. Energy does not end.
That's very interesting because we never think about what happens after death happens, after one's disincarnate. What happens next? Does one stay in that state indefinitely? Is there a hologram effect where that is now a thing that exists, even if the disincarnate goes on to something else? Where there's a lot of science to apply there as well. I mean, the universe is what, 17.3 billion years old, and we can track back through science pretty much the molecular changes from a trillionth of a second after we perceive it to be created. So This is a very long period of time. What happens to the dead? People say to me, clients come to me all the time, and they want to talk to people who died 2,000 years ago or 500 years ago, and they say to me, "Can I do that?" And I say, well, unless it's some big deal celebrity or some ruler, which I don't bother with most of the time because those people are so tapped out from others attempting to talk to them that they are less than willing to communicate unless it is somebody that they're actually interested in. I say to them, they say to me all the time, does it matter how long they've been dead? I love this question. And I say, well, does it matter how long you've been alive? And this is always a startling moment. And I say, well, if you had come to me 20 years ago and wanted to talk to somebody, if you come to me now and you want to talk to somebody, what's the difference? There's a lot of science on this. I think to understand what happens to them ultimately in the long run, what happens to all of us ultimately in the long run, because it's very important to remember that we're all part of the same story, we have to start thinking about the science of the thing. What happens to their energy? Where do they go? Where do we go? Do we proceed back into a greater energy to become planetary in some way? I mean, Morgan, you have some science on this you want to talk about tonight?
Yes, I do, and there's an awful lot, so I'm going to break this up a bit, not try to throw it all at everybody at one time.
Right.
But I think the energy is a very big thing, and specific types of energy, and I'm going to get into that in a second. But the real big question, I think, is what are the dead made of? Because they have to be made of something. Many people say the disincarnate are just pure energy, and if that's the case, though, how do some people see them? Why do people report being touched or scratched or bit by the disincarnate? And what about hearing that the disincarnate move objects? So it's a complex question, because if they were some form of matter that could interact with the physical world, we'd all see them all the time, or most of us would, and we'd also be bumping into them a lot, but that doesn't happen. Essentially, that has to mean that from a physics standpoint, the disincarnate don't have mass, or at least they don't have mass all of the time. And I do want to clear up the definition of mass, because it's not the same thing as weight. A lot of people believe it is. But really, mass is an object's resistance to changing its speed or changing its energy level. And you would think that everything that we can see, everything that exists, has mass. But there are things that do not have mass. And this is the example I'm going to use. These are particles called bosons. They mediate fundamental forces of nature like electromagnetism and gravity. And I want to focus specifically on the photon, not proton, PR, but photon, PH. It's one of the most plentiful particles in the universe, and it mediates or carries the electromagnetic force. If I was going to suggest any material for the disincarnate to be made of other than pure energy, it would be cohesive clouds of photons. And it may just be that they simply have a way of amassing photons around them and using them to interact with the physical world that we, the living, know. And it works on a number of levels. So, like I said, photons have no mass, so you wouldn't have to worry about bumping into the disincarnate. You wouldn't notice them at all unless there was some reason that they wanted to be seen. And how can you use these photons to manifest? One of the simplest ways, because they mediate the electromagnetic force, is to generate a static electric field. to gather dust around them into whatever shape they desire, including a representation of themselves. And we hear sometimes in accounts of the disincarnate that they seem to be transparent or translucent, not totally visible, not totally solid. And sometimes they are even described as monochromatic, like they're entirely gray images. And if they were using a static electric field to gather dust around them, that definitely would be a good description of it. But there's also visible light, and because photons mediate the entire electromagnetic spectrum, that means the wavelengths of light that we can see. So all they would have to do, if they can somehow control photons or are made of photons, is simply up their energy level to the point where they were oscillating and become visible light wavelengths. But there's always that question, is why do some people see them and other people don't, even in the same room? Why does one person see the disincarnate and someone else not? That's something I want to delve into later. But I do want to address the one big issue is how do the disincarnate physically interact with the world, touching people, moving objects? Since photons have no mass, they can't move anything. And that's where we bring in this thing known as the Higgs field. This is the field that, as nearest physicists can determine, permeates the entire universe, and it's what gives everything mass. It was confirmed in 2012 in the high-energy particle collision experiments in Sweden at the CERN facility, where they actually isolated a Higgs particle, which is one of the limitless number of particles that makes up the Higgs field. And every particle that has mass interacts with the Higgs field in some way. And I'm just going to give a simple illustration. Let's say you have a ping pong ball and you're standing on one side of a small inflatable kiddie pool filled with water. And the water will represent the Higgs field and the ping pong ball will just represent a generic particle. So first you throw the ping pong ball over the pool to a friend standing on the other side. The ball never touches the water. That, in this essence, is what happens between a massless particle like a photon and the Higgs field. There's no interaction. That's why photons have no mass. Now you drop the ball on top of the water, kind of flick it with your fingers, and it moves pretty easily over the water to your friend on the other side of the pool, but it's not quite as effortless as it was when you tossed the ball. And then next you totally submerge the ball. You keep pushing it down because it doesn't want to be underwater, and you have to expend even more energy to keep it under the water while you push it to the other side of the pool. So basically, depending on how deeply various particles immerse themselves or interact with the Higgs fields, they have varying degrees of mass. So it may be possible for the disincarnate to interact with the Higgs field and create a mechanism for massless photons they're manipulating to gain mass. And that would allow them to interact with the physical world, to touch people, even to kiss people, and yes, move that face across the table to freak you out.
Well, you know, the interesting... I'm sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. I was just going to wrap up and say the reason I like photons so much as interacting with the disincarnate is because they are massless, and massless particles do not decay. Every other particle decays. It takes a long time for something like a neutron to decay, but photons do not decay. So if the dead are somehow intermingled with or working with photons, they could truly be essentially endless beings. As many of us believe the dead seem to be, that they just go on forever. That could possibly be the case if they're working with these massless particles.
It could be the case, and there's a very strong, some very strong science on it possibly being the case. I want to talk for a second about and add to that the idea of one of the four pillars of the science of sorcery in the way that I have presented it to students and to people who want to read about my way of working, is that we work with a thing called the iron ring. And if we're pushing the energy of the iron ring out, what is happening is what we're affecting in the long run is being affected by the energy we're pushing between ourselves and the other thing or object or person. And so when you talk about the disincarnate moving things, it is my understanding from them that what's happening is they're moving the energy between themselves and the thing or the person whom they're trying to contact. Even something soft like a touch or a kiss is still the moving of air, compacting the energy around it into a small place and having the living feel it. So when it comes to the Higgs field, it is really, like you said, it's an energy field that permeates the entire universe. And mass is therefore defined in a manner in which people are not used to hearing it defined. It's defined by how other things interact with this energy. So it is my thought that what they are is, and we could talk about the particles in a minute, what they are is that which can move the energy between them and another person or another object, moving that energy field, that electromagnetic field. So they're not actually touching us per se, but they are, in a sense, using energy and sort of shaping it and pushing it against us so that we can feel it. And when we see them, I have a lot of ideas about why we see them, why some people see them, why some people don't, and why they often look like they are covered in dust or that they're made out of dust. And I think that there's two schools of thought in that, both the reflection of how we see them, the playing of light on particles that we don't understand or don't really have a grasp on yet, and the intermingling with what demons leave, which is dust, a particular type of dust, of particles that we can see but are unfamiliar with in that way, because they don't last. Once you get it, it sort of disintegrates to the point where we're no longer actually seeing it. So there's many of these kinds of theories about what we're seeing, how we're seeing it, who sees it, who doesn't see it. I see the disincarnate very often in full body, as if they are a living human being standing in front of me. There are many occasions in which I'm not sure I know the difference. I'll look for clues, which makes me wonder how many I see all the time walking down the street. I'm probably seeing more than I think I'm seeing, because often if I'm seeing a disincarnate in full form, it could be someone who's just standing right in front of me and I don't always know. They usually say something to me that gives me the indication that I am seeing somebody who is having the evolved experience of being disincarnate. But what they're made out of, they have to be made out of something, because they can move the energy between themselves and us. And there's a lot of theories about what they can be made out of. But what does it feel like? What does it feel like when they touch us? It feels different than it feels when a living human being touches us. Are either of you having that experience where you can feel them touching you and you know that it feels different than what it would feel like if another living human being touched you? Chris, you have any thoughts on
yes.
this?
Yeah, I've had, as you and I have talked about before, I have one that follows me around.
Yes.
And it's been there for a while. And I can always tell when it's nearby because of the change in the energy level. I've always been under the impression that science backs it up that we never totally touch anybody. Our skin never comes in contact with anything. It's always a buffer of energy around it. There's always something. What I think, their energy is different than ours because it's not within this skin. I think the skin has a lot to do with it because it's an organ. There's other processes going on here, and it's taking some of the energy away from it. Once this is gone, the energy is 100% free. There's nothing else for it to do. It's just there. That also would make it not as dense as what it is now. It's compact, it's inside something, so it has its boundaries. When the body's not there anymore, it's almost like a balloon. I mean, when a balloon pops, the air comes out and it expands. I think that's what happens with the disincarnate. It expands. And I think they have to be able to pull it back in order for it to be something that has mass that we can see.
So
unfortunately...
Then let me ask you a question to you, Chris. So I understand all that, and I accept that as something that is probably true, and I even agree with you. And how do we hear them? See, I think that there is a level of sorcery that must be laid in over the science at all times. And what that actually means, if you look at the Tesla model, is that you think it's sorcery now, but eventually you figure out how to do it, and you know that it's science. So how do we hear them? How are they speaking to us? Because people hear the disincarnate in two different ways. They hear them either through sort of a sense of it happening through their own mind, and which leads me to my theory about thoughts, ideas, and intentions. And we also hear them as they're standing in front of us and just speaking to us. So if we are going to explain touch or the sensation of their presence, physical sensation, in this way that you're explaining it, and you're absolutely right, there is a great deal of science on the fact that no two things actually touch each other, that even when you clap your own hands, there is a layer between one hand and the other of forced air or forced material in some way. So then how are they making sounds? How are they telling us their thoughts? Do you have any thoughts on that?
There you go. The clapping was a perfect example of what I was going to say. You clap your hands, it makes a noise, even though they're not touching. If you slow your hands down and put them together, you don't make a noise.
Right.
Now, before you talk, there's a thought process. You don't just randomly blurt out words. Well, yeah, I do, but that's beside the point. Most people think before they open their mouth. And there, like I said, there's a thought there. You string a sentence together. You put syllables. You put words. You put letters. You know what you're going to say before you say it. Now, once you free yourself of your body, I believe that your brain, or what powers your brain, expands. Like you said, with the personalities that gets more enhanced. Well, if your personality gets more enhanced, there's got to be something else that gets more enhanced too. You have all this energy and it's not doing anything. It has to go somewhere. Thoughts are all energy. They're all electronic impulses. So it's got to go. You've got to be able to use that. I think we pick up on what's being thought by these people. They can't talk, but they can transfer energy that way. You're speaking, and basically you're sending out energy anyway, or people wouldn't hear it.
So do you think that when they are talking to us that they are forming sound, or that some of them are forming sound? Because I hear them in two different ways. I hear them standing right in front of me, saying to me what they desire to say and having me hear it on that very human one-to-one kind of level. And then I hear them in other ways. I hear them in my mind, and then I turn and say, okay, I hear you. What else do you want to tell me? And it's sort of the way a communication opens. Because I think all thoughts, ideas, and intentions have physical weight. There is a part of matter called the graviton. And in physics, the graviton is a hypothetical elementary particle that mediates the force of gravitation in the framework of quantum field theory. So what that really means is that first of all, there's absolutely no proof that it exists, because if it exists, the graviton is expected to be massless. And if we're talking about massless, then we're talking about that which is not interacting with energy, and that it is what's referred to as a spin tube boson, which means that it is a boson reacting to the presence of another boson. And we can talk about these tiny bits of matter, and we can talk about what they may or may not be all night, and I'm enjoying that very much, and I hope we continue to do so. But I am, because I'm in service to them, always want to remember as we're talking that they have emotional moments, and they have thoughts, ideas, and intentions. So when we talk about how we see them and whether we can feel them, I think it is equally as important to talk about how we can hear them, why we can hear them. And that, I think, is very important to talk about, because I will tell you, clients come to me all the time and they'll say, well, I hear my mother's voice, or I hear somebody's voice, and I know what it is that she's saying to me, but I'm afraid to listen. So there's all of these very interesting nuances about this communication, that I think that if we can find some science on, it would be a relief for individuals. But how do we know? How do we know what we're hearing? How do we know that what we're hearing is not just a response of our own emotions to the moment? Are we developing our ideas, our thoughts, and our intentions so profoundly that we're creating some way to allow in the voice of the disincarnate? I think that's an important question. What is the emotional component?
I don't think we do that because we have no emotional attachment. Other people, I would imagine that if you're hearing, say, your mother, your brother, whoever, I think it's a choice I think you make the choice in your mind. You know, if I tell you that I'm making spaghetti tonight, you know what that's supposed to sound like, what it's supposed to smell like. If I put in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, I don't even have to play it. You know what it sounds like. I think that's what happens when we hear somebody's voice that we recognize. I don't think so much it's the voice that we recognize, it's the energy that we recognize, and we put the sound to it.
Okay, so how does that explain then talking to the disincarnate that you don't know? Because when people come to me and they say, I'm hearing my dead nephew's voice, and they want to be able to hear more or communicate further, or they have a sense that that person is there, because there are two very different kinds of people that come to me when it comes to necromancy. There are the people who have a specific individual who is either already attempting to communicate with them or that they want to communicate with, and then there are the people who tell me that they are quote-unquote haunted, that something is following them around, that something is communicating with them, that something, they hear a voice, they hear this kind of thing. And I would say that I see an equal amount of each of those people, because necromancy and working with clients is a big part of my practice in this work. So how do we define, or how do we start to explain hearing those voices of people who we aren't familiar with? Because your theory about that which you're familiar with is very actual. But what happens when, you're sitting alone or you're sitting with friends and all of a sudden you hear another voice saying, oh, I remember being able to do that when I was alive. How do we explain that? Any thoughts?
It's a very touchy thing, I think, because I think if people don't have an experience or background with this, the first thing they're going to think is, am I hallucinating? Am I going crazy?
Absolutely.
Or they may think, though, they may think, well, I heard something from the other room, so there may be a period of denial. I think one of the sadnesses to me is that I know of cases of people who were treated very heavily for schizophrenia and other mental illnesses, and it turned out that they didn't need this, and this was traumatic for them, because when these drugs that they use are intended to readjust your brain's chemistry, when your brain's chemistry is not out of whack, these drugs can have severely debilitating effects. But what happened with some of them was they, took themselves out of that scenario where they were being treated for it, and they were introduced to people who would give them some insight and say, well, you may really be hearing something. And they were from different spiritual traditions, the two people I know about, but in both cases, they made an astonishing recovery once they learned to accept that, yes, they were really hearing this, and went on to lead perfectly fulfilling and high-functioning lives with, no trace of not being able to cope with reality. They were just coping with reality in a different way because their reality for them was different than what reality is for a lot of people.
Morgan, I've talked about this before, but it's a good time to mention it again. There was a client that I had a number of years ago who I saw a few times and in his complete state of desperation. And he came to me saying, they've tried all the drugs and I'm still hearing these three voices, and they're telling me these crazy complex stories of their lives and all this stuff that he was saying. So what I did was I finally met with him and sat down and I said, okay, well, let me listen for them. And what was happening was he lived on a Civil War battleground, and there were 3 soldiers who were living their death over and over again. And then once we developed a relationship with them, then he was under control. And this is a guy who went from being heavily medicated and treated like, an inpatient his whole life to a guy who is now doing this work. And the freeing of that experience. And there was another client who firmly believed that he was formerly let's just say, a member of the Tudor royal family. And what it turned out to be was that individual from that period of time was speaking to him. And the constant discussion he allowed to sort of take over his own thought process, and he felt that he was that person, and that wasn't really what was happening. So you're absolutely right. These kinds of experiences are often mistaken for individuals who are having multiple personality issues, experiencing some paranoia or schizophrenia. And again, I am neither a physicist nor a psychiatrist or a psychologist. What I am is a person with extraordinary experience in talking to the dead and to the people who want to talk to them as well. So, part of our job is to clear that up. If I'm hearing it also, it's not you having a multiple personality. People come to me often to distinguish the difference between the two. Right now I'm dealing with a young girl who has a dead relative, essentially, who is inhabiting her and forcing her to make all sorts of gestures and inappropriateness in her life, and we are trying to separate the two. And she's I think 14 or 15 years old, if that. So these kinds of practices are vital in this work. Chris, you have a very close disincarnate you were talking about, who
yes.
seems to be a big part of your life.
And I'm not sure when I picked this one up, but it's been with me as far back as I can remember. And I always look at this like, it all depends on what doctor you go to. If I tell it to one doctor, I'm a prophet. If I tell it to somebody else, they're going to lock me the hell up. But I can tell when it's their voice talking to me.
Mm-hmm.
One time I was late. I was running late. I was going nuts. I had to get to work, and my keys kept moving. I mean, every time I think I had them, it's like I know I put them on the counter, but they weren't there. I'd go back and I'd run around the house. I couldn't find them, and I was getting more frustrated. Finally got the keys. I'm running. I'm going to be 5 minutes late, and as soon as I turned on the one road that I usually took, it had been raining like torrentially for a week, and it was finally a nice clear day, and I'm getting ready to go up, and as I turned onto the road, I watched a tree fall. Mm-hmm. It literally just fell right in front of me, and if I would have been 2 minutes earlier, it would have fell across my truck.
And you feel this was a disincarnate that had made these adjustments, not a demon?
Oh, I know she did. I know it, because I've heard so many times, don't do that. And every time I do what I said not to do, what was told me not to do, I got kicked in the ass for it.
Right. So when you participate appropriately, you get a better outcome. And by participate appropriately, I mean listen to what's being said or offered to you.
If it's one of those things where it's don't go in there, and I go, I'm not going anyway, I'll find out I should have listened. Sometimes it used to come to me when I was working. I would be working on something, and the next thing you know, I would hear, no, it's over here. And I wouldn't listen, because I had it set in my mind that it was something else, and I'll find out 5 minutes later I should have listened.
That's what life in service to the disincarnate looks like, because they are often in the situation to become in service to us. There is a particular disincarnate who I've dedicated my books to and whatnot, who is in life would have been as unlikely to participate with me as possible, although he did on some level. We had a number of brief interactions, and the interesting part about this is someone who I actually met, as I'm saying, in life, and who after he became disincarnate became even more involved in my life on a daily basis. And the interesting thing to me is that this is a person whose ideology and the way that they lived would have been as far right, if you will, from where I stand as possible. And yet, not only does he participate with me on an almost daily basis, he makes very profound and loud and clear statements about things that will not serve me well. He will say, don't do that. Do something else. Stop here. He's very, very clear. Sometimes I see him. I don't always see him, but I always hear his voice, or I can feel the hairs of his beard against the side of my face as if he's whispering. I feel that often, and I'm grateful, very, very grateful to that. Is it happening? Of course it's happening. People say to me, how do you know it's happening? And every time somebody questions, how do you know it's happening, he will do something like whisper something into my ear that I will, of course, never have known to say to that person. There was a situation once where I was talking to somebody who said to me, oh, it's your ego. It's just your ego. You just want this person to talk to you. None of this is really happening. And he said to me, ask her this. And it was a very, very intense question about names of two people I would never have known, and are they doing this and that. And she became sort of dumbfounded by it. And a week later came back to me and said, okay, how did you do it? It was a trick. So people are still in such a state of denial that anything happens past the roadblock of death, and they see it that way, that anything else is going on. And it is our work as people involved in necromancy to be in service of the disincarnate by stating that they are in fact with us. There are more of them than there are of us. That's the numbers. If you look at the human experience in evolution, more people have died than are living right now. So therefore, there are just clearly and simply more of them than there are of us. Morgan, do we have any comments in the chat room?
Yeah, we do. And there's one, and it kind of goes directly to what you're saying about more of them than there are of us. Well, where are all these people? How can they possibly be in this space? And we had talked earlier about, well, if they don't have mass, yes, it could happen. But one of our listeners, Darren, had said that he thinks it's possible that the disincarnate exist in a different sort of reality, and opening a portal to communicate with them is opening a sort of wormhole into another dimension. And I want to point out that if you look at it from the standpoint of things like string theory, there are more than the four dimensions that we have, the up, down, back, forth, and sideways, and then time, which is the fourth dimension. In string theory, you have, I think, 11 or 12 dimensions. They're said to be very small, so that we can't really access them in our physical bodies, but seriously, how small or how large is the disincarnate? Could they actually have access to these? So what do you think, Sorceress and Chris, is it possible that from a scientific standpoint we could be talking about opening up a wormhole into another dimension, and that's how we're making contact with the disincarnate?
I think that the concept of a dimension is a living human thing, and it's a limited thing, and it's a language that we use because we must. And therefore, it's very, very useful. The Casimir effect, which I've talked about quite a bit, is a physics theory that has to do with whether or not there can be the thing called a vacuum, whether there could be a nothing. And in the Casimir effect, groups of tiny particles jump together so that they can be seen, and then for some reason come apart so that they are no longer able to be seen. There are individuals in the theoretical physicist area of study that think that means that there are times within the Casimir effect that there is nothing there, as opposed to, and that there is an actual void, as opposed to the reality of the fact that things can be seen when they group together in larger amounts, and then they can choose to not group together in larger amounts. And I think that the disincarnate around us are very much that kind of thing. They can present themselves in full body because that's how we need to see them. Chris had said something about they can change shape, or they can, I don't remember exactly what you said, Chris, but that they can present themselves in various ways. How do they do that? How is it possible that they can do that? Is that a technique that one develops post-life? Do the disincarnate develop an ability to shapeshift, to become larger and smaller, to become transparent or less transparent, or is it our perception of how we're seeing them? Because if I can see some of them so clearly that I'm not sure if they're alive or dead, and then I see others just barely in a shadow, and then I hear some loud and clear, and others I barely hear a whisper of, and I have to listen closely, or I have to prepare an environment in which they can settle into comfortably to bait them in and allow them to be present in their own level of comfort, then, how is it possible that they are in another dimension? I think they're right here. I think what's happening is that we train ourselves out of the ability to see that which is dead. The human experience is one of fear, and fear defined in my world as a combination of inconvenience and not knowing what to do next. I think that this is a greater blocker than all the New Age crap tells you it is. They say, oh, be fearless. But that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about fear, or this concept of blocking that which we have questions about, that which makes us have to look at our own mortality. I don't think it's another dimension, to answer Darren's question. I think that it is all happening at the same time, but that the richness of it is so grand and so enormous that the human eye, the human mind perhaps even, cannot see its structure in a way that is as broad as it is. We can only see so much of what's in front of us. Thoughts?
I'd like to... Oh, go on, Chris.
I was told years ago from a Native American that I was talking to, I was friends with, he's since passed. And he always told me that the dead are always just at the end of your fingertips. And at the time, it's like that was really heavy when I thought about it. That it's so close, but yet we can't touch it. And I think that has to do with, like you said, we don't see it because we choose not to see it. We don't want to see it because we're afraid of it. We're programmed from an early age that ghosts scare you, that be afraid of the dead, that they're going to come back and get you. Look how many stories there are of things coming back from the dead. No wonder people are afraid of it. And I think that, like you said, that's what blocks us off, is the fear of it. If we open ourselves up to it and we accept it for what it is, just another part of life, if we look at it as what we do when we turn 21 and we can drink, it would be a whole different outlook. I have to say, as much as I agree with religions, if you look at religions like the Muslim religions, things like that, they're not afraid to die. And why is that? Why are they not afraid?
I don't know that they're not afraid to die. That's really a broader scope about what they think their God wants. So maybe I think for them, being afraid to offend their God is their position.
But we don't do that in this country. We're afraid of what's on the other end. So we're not going to see things. People like us, we're different. We see things, we're more open to everything. But I think the normal person don't, because they don't want to. it's a big. The boogeyman's on the other side of your fingertips. That's why they don't want to see it. That's why they come to people like us. We're not afraid.
Right. We're not afraid because we know that we don't have a choice. I mean, I think the lack of my definition of fear, the lack of that experience of inconvenience and not knowing what to do next, those two things are unplugged from my experience with the Disincarnate. I'm not inconvenienced because I made a decision that I would be in service to them, and I do know what to do next, which is to address them directly most of the time. I mean, there are occasions in which that is perhaps not the best choice, but most of the time that is the best choice. So I feel like those two things unplugged allows us to be able to, people like you and I and Morgan, and we can step in front of the train and deal with what's coming. The issue is that most people don't want to deal not so much with the Disincarnate, but with their own mortality issue, this fear of death. That's what I think is the meat on the bone here. People are terrified of death. They associate death with finality, and we happen to know that that's not necessarily the case for everyone. I mean, it's probably not the case for anyone, but amongst the Disincarnate who choose to continue to participate, that is not the case. There are people I know who live full time with a Disincarnate spouse or a Disincarnate child or friend who doesn't really ever leave their side. You know, we talk about attending demons, but we don't really talk so much about attending Disincarnate. I don't like to use that word because with Disincarnate usually because the Disincarnate are people who are living human beings. So I would prefer to say a full-time association goes on. But I think that the issue is a fear of what they perceive to be the pain or the trauma of death. More so in America, I agree. I mean, look at the Japanese suicide forest. People have supported that by going there and performing suicide for a very, very long time. And Morgan, I think you're familiar with that.
Oh yeah, the Okigahara Forest, which is at the base of Mount Fuji. It's I haven't had a chance to go there yet, but Japan definitely. I've been there twice to Japan, and it definitely has a unique energy. And I could almost see why the cultural differences shape the energy that are there, and the cultural themes shape the energy that are there just as much as the natural energy of the land, which I have to say is incredibly intense because it does sit on multiple tectonic plate boundaries, and so the electromagnetic energy that just fluctuates and jumps all over there is enough to put you into an alternate state of reality and make you look at reality in a different way just by itself.
You know, the wonderful thing about what you just said is that when we think as Americans or as Europeans, we think about the Japanese, we feel like they are very different from us, that they are, and I say this because of my understanding of how people feel, that they are almost a different species from us. Their culture is so outside of our understanding, and that's all I mean by that it's so outside of our understanding that we don't know how to address it, how to perform in it, or how to function around it. And the purity of that is really quite startling. They live on as you said, really an electromagnetic plate that is like almost nowhere else in the world. And it creates this high-frequency sensitivity. And the flip side to this high-frequency sensitivity is a high-frequency adherence almost to one's own focus. So they can become profoundly focused on things, and therefore they see the elongation of the human experience, I think, in a way that Americans don't.
Yeah, definitely. I have to say the first time I went there, I'm sensitive to other people's energies, and when I went there, the difference from what I feel here in the U.S., on a train here in the U.S., and what I felt on the train there was so astonishing that I had a hard time functioning for my first couple days there. They have a shielding that they put up, this politeness that they always enforce upon themselves, just so as a closed, very, high population, dense society, they can get along without killing each other. And so they're not as forthcoming with what they're thinking inside as people in America might be. However, I've got to say that thin veneer really masks a lot of stuff underneath.
Oh, sure.
And as you pointed out, the intensity there, it was mind-boggling, and it took me at least 2 whole days to be able to readjust so that I could cope with that and figure out, okay, there's nothing wrong with me, there's nothing wrong with the scenario, nothing bad is going to happen, but it just was such a huge difference. And I think that speaks to how much we as individuals can force ourselves to believe something or to see something or to not see something. And just as Chris was saying before, we train ourselves not to see certain things. And that's one of the blocks that people have to actually communicating with the dead.
It is, absolutely, disguised as a thing called fear, but broken down into not knowing how to perform or what to do, and seeing a reflection of one's own mortality. I want to bring up this idea of cold spots, and this concept that when the dead are present, the room goes cold. And I can tell you that is not a thing that always happens, but that happens more when there is a larger presence of the disincarnate. In the studio, there was a moment when about 30 showed up, and I've talked about it a lot of times, and the room took an enormous drop in temperature. Last night, I was speaking with one of the students, one of our associates that we all know, on chat, and we were going back and forth till about 3 in the morning and discussing various aspects of working with the disincarnate. And while I was talking with him, it happened to be a night where I was working with the disincarnate and with demons in various ways. It was a very busy night in this area. The temperature in the room I was in went down to 41 degrees from 67 in a very, very short period of time. It was quite cold. No other room in the house was experiencing that, just in that one room. And I was thinking today about what those cold spots are, and in that moment there were about a dozen disincarnate who had shown up together at the same time in the room to express to me something that I needed to take heed to, that I wasn't seeing or had not been made privy to prior to that moment. So I thought about what these cold spots are, and the cold spots are not per se where the disincarnate are. They are in fact where the carnate, where life is not. And they come in with this very powerful presence, especially those who really know how to do it. And as we move along, we can address what it means for them to really know how to do it. And they take up the energy of the heat around them. Because heat absorption in the living means that the more heat you absorb, the less energetic you are. You're essentially, if you want to use the actual definition of the word burdened, you are burdened with this greater heat, and therefore you're not functioning with quite the energy level that you could function with. And if you think about that in the very sort of pedantic way that if it's 100 degrees out, you move slower, you feel less strength, less drive than if it's a crisp day. But this idea that when the disincarnate show up, the room goes cold because they are there, it's really what they're doing is they're holding a place. They're creating essentially their own iron ring. They're pushing away the energy of the heat, and they're standing there in what they function best in, which is a lower temperature and a faster speed of molecular movement. That's what I've been experiencing more and more, these groups performing in this way, and I don't mean performing as intentionally performing, but presenting in this way. So, Chris, your experiences with the disincarnate, have you experienced those cold spots?
I haven't had, now with the ones that are, especially the one that's around me, I haven't felt a cold spot, but I have had others tell me that when they're not well liked, they feel a heaviness on them. I had one person tell me that was sitting in the front seat of my car one time that you feel like somebody sitting on their lap. I said, well, that's because you're in her spot and you need to go in the back seat. Now, a group of them, I haven't felt a big amount of cold. When I felt cold the most was when I did some healing work, and I was kind of, I've told you before that I can do distance healing. And sometimes when I do that and I'm around that area, when I'm not quite here and I'm not quite there, I do feel cold around me. Now, I don't know if it's because of how it's set up on that end of it, Once I cross over, if that's why it gets cold, if it's pulling the energy away from me or what it's doing. But I do get a sense of being cold at that point.
Well, how does this all fit into what we as living human beings stand in, like this idea of gravity? You know, Isaac Newton devised the first serious theory of gravity in the 1600s. It's a really long time ago, but it's a theory. It's very important to remember the word theory. He described gravity as a field that could not reach out across great distances, and dictate the path of massive objects like the Earth. So if his theory is fact, then how does gravity affect this experience of being disincarnate in the same plane with those of us who still are experiencing a physical body? Because as we know, nobody can absolutely define what gravity is. We can define what this thing called gravity does, but not what it is. So if we are all in the same place, and this goes to what's cold and what's hot, and I have a theory about this, what a shock, but how are we experiencing gravity at the same time? Are they experiencing gravity? Are they experiencing the weight, the physical weight of the planet, this atmosphere? Anybody have any ideas about that?
Well, I'm sure they're experiencing some aspect of it. I would think that, you know, just from an energetic standpoint, they must be experiencing the magnetics of the Earth, the electromagnetic fields in the Earth, and probably experiencing the really strong electromagnetic fields generated by intense thunderstorms. So I'm sure they have some experience with it. It's a little hard for me to get the concept around of what they might be experiencing gravity as, because I think I'm still tied down to this notion that they don't essentially have any kind of mass once they're no longer in a human body. I wonder what that would be like. I have a hard time thinking about it. I've had dreams about flying and dreams about floating, but being able to grasp what that existence would be like, to not be tied to a physical body and therefore not have the weight of gravity affecting my movement and my momentum, is a little hard for me to comprehend.
I think that they are tied to a physical body, and I think that what the idea of what a physical body is changes. If thoughts, ideas, and intentions have physical weight, then they don't lose that. They have more of a broader view of their entire living experience, so they're carrying a lot of thoughts, ideas, and intentions. If that's happening, then their idea of what a physical body is might be different. They might be experiencing, and I'm thinking about some of the things that they've said to me, that their sense of desire or wanting or love or hate or anger or resentment, all these things are very physical to them in a way that we just entertain them as physical. You know, they say if you have too much stress, your body breaks down, all this kind of thing, and all that is very true. But what happens if the body as we know it is not there, and they're still experiencing those kinds of things? There's a great deal of resentment that I've seen in a number of disincarnate that I've spoken to, still resenting how they were treated or how they died or what was taken away from them in their life experience. Those things are so tangible to them, so factual, that is their physical body. And by the fact that they're sharing it with us, it creates even more tangibility. I think that third stage is coming back into tangibility, not in the sense of reincarnation, but that the dead become tangible again in the same way that demons work very hard to become tangible. This is something I don't talk about often or haven't discussed much, and I'm going to actually be talking about this in our Wednesday night classes, is that I think that from what they tell me, the reason that I can see some of them in full body and not others is the ones that I can see in full body have made it their effort to be present physically again. And by made it their effort, we're operating, in apples and oranges. Our version of made it their effort is going out and doing a particular thing over and over and working at it and making it right. I'm not sure that that's what their effort is. I think their effort is creating some kind of tangibility by collecting various types of matter. And this is something that is really unique in this conversation. We haven't people don't really talk about it. The idea of reincarnation or reinhabitation is common, but the idea of reformation is not. And I didn't mention that I was going to bring this up tonight, but I throw it out on the floor if anybody wants to talk about the possibility that reformation exists over time, and of course time being their version of time, not ours. Any thoughts on that?
Well, sure it's good, because we're talking about something that is going through different transitions, but essentially it's energetic transitions. It's even if we're talking about something that has, some sort of physical form, even if it is just what I was saying so long ago, gathering together photons to manifest itself, still there's a constant thing there, and it's the nature of energy to change. It doesn't dissipate, but it changes. And I think that's absolutely makes perfect sense that there would be some of the disincarnate who are able to go through that transition, and others who don't want to or haven't figured out how to.
What if I said, and Chris, let me ask you this question. What if I said to you that I know someone who used to be dead, and that individual had an experience of life, had an experience of going through death, became a disincarnate, communicated with me while disincarnate, and has become so profoundly transitioned into physical weight that I see them as fully living. I can be touched by this individual. This individual can speak and other people can hear him. There are those around who don't know that he is actually still disincarnate and who are hearing him. And in terms of your enormous experience in powwow medicine and all of the wonderful things that you've studied, where does that place? Is there a culture for that? Is that a thing that you've heard of before?
Not so much. That it almost sounds you're almost getting into the Norse with the Draugr, but even that's kind of vague. The closest that would probably be with the reincarnation in the Buddhist and the Hindu faith. But to totally materialize as an individual and not go through a birth process, that's kind of open to new exploration.
Yeah. What if I were to say that an individual who went through all those things, and I want to push this point, has recreated physicality in himself so that really nobody knows of or remembers his death? What would you think about that? Is that something that you can talk about or add your thoughts about to? Because in many of the things you've studied, there is sort of a peppering of this, and I'm interested in Morgan's ideas about this also.
I don't see any reason why it couldn't happen. And for people to come back, you have to look at all myths, and they all are based in some kind of fact, or they wouldn't have anything to base the story on. So I'm trying to come up with something that talks about somebody coming back in full form instead of going through the whole birth process and life again. But it almost sounds to me, I don't know if you've touched on any of this before in your practice, is when people talk about a walk-in, where they believe another soul came in.
I know what a walk-in is, but that's not what I'm describing.
Well, no, but I wonder if that's what people mistaken it for.
Yes, probably. I think that people would mistake it for a lot of things if they knew that he was dead. And this is not a zombie situation. This is a situation where there is an individual who's presenting themselves as someone who's never died and moving on with his life, who has been able to present himself in physicality in a way that people see him and touch him and experience him and listen to him, both his comments and sometimes his music and this kind of thing. So, Morgan, do you have any thoughts on this? Is there any experience that you've had that lends itself to talk about this sort of thing?
Not with any human entity that has ever come back that I could, put a finger on and say, well, yes, they died, and then it's not the physical body resurrecting, as you said, not a zombie situation. It like I said, matter changes form all the time, and energy changes form all the time. So certainly I could see how it would happen. I think much of it has to do with you say he's recreated his physicality, but so much of it has to be the reception of the people around him, their perception of him. And he is, in recreating physicality, he has been able to alter their perceptions of what happened to him and who he was at a certain point, which was a disincarnate, so that now they perceive him as someone who is incarnate. And I think that has to go really far, give us an idea of just how much the disincarnate can influence our perceptions of them. It sounds to me like he's got a real deep, powerful tie-in to these people to make them think that he is really actually still there and is actually living again.
Well, I'll tell you about a bit about a ritual and what my understanding of long-term ritual is. And this is something I'm only going to tap onto a tiny bit on the radio, and something that I will discuss further with the core group. A situation can exist where an individual can decide that before they reach the moment of being disincarnate, that the individuals around them, now these are sorcerers, these are people like myself who have certain abilities to bend energy and to push energy and play with energy in a way that we do in this group and others don't, because they haven't learned that, or they've chosen not to have that in their life. And the people around this individual disagreed with his right to become dead. And what happened was they provided an energy so that his body in its illness could go through this transition and be placed somewhere to rot, as they all do, and that his disincarnate self could be handled in such a way where enough energy was placed upon that individual so that he was actually physical again. And this, when I talk about ritual, I'm talking about years of work. So the idea of necromancy, and I want to move in this direction for a minute, is not what people always think about. I don't just sit around and say, oh, come to my space and we'll sit and we'll talk to your dead. It isn't always like that. It is a much deeper and much more unique and odd practice than just that. And I say just that as if it's something everyone can do, but it's not. The title that I place upon myself, when I call myself Sorceress, this is not something that I decided one day was a fun thing to do and I'd pop it up on Facebook. This is something that I have earned over a great deal of angst and work and spent decades doing. And I can tell you now that I'm working in a group of people, aside from the core group, a small group of sorcerers who have created the situation where this individual has now begun to go out in public and be seen by others who didn't know him to begin with, and is having essentially a real life in full form. And I do want to talk about that more in the group, but if we're talking about energy and matter, even at this advanced place in this experience, we still don't know what he's made of. And that there are occasions under which some of us can touch him and some of us can't. Some of us don't feel it. Our hands go right through. So his matter is still unstable some of the time, but not all of the time. What I will say is that there is no vampiric feeding, and I don't mean like a vampire. I mean the idea of vampiric feeding, meaning an energy, him constantly looking for an energy source. What he is doing is has figured out a way to reconnect to the matter of being living. And in that experience is presenting an opportunity for those of us who know how to do it to experience him fully. So I know that Morgan, you have experience in voodoo and various other areas. Does this ring any bells to you?
There is nothing that I can place. I mean, we, discarded the whole "this is not a zombie" thing because you're not bringing back a body.
No, this is not a zombie. The body is buried. It is somewhere and is buried. That I can tell you. Yeah,
there is something called the zombie astral, which is basically the energy of the person. And typically, what happens with the zombie astral is this is kept in a small pot called a govi, and this is, can be sent out to do work. This is done, it's called left-hand work, and it's done by a group of people called Bokors, who are considered evil sorcerers in the voodoo religion. But there is not really any way that the two mesh. There is a definite separation between the plain body of the person and the zombie astral, which is the essence of the person. So I've never heard of a zombie astral ever being called into physical manifestation and being able to do the things that you're speaking of, interacting with people. There may be a way to do it for a brief period of time to attack a person, but even then I think that would be a tenuous sort of manifestation. So, no, I can't think of anything that I've heard of in any of my studies of any religions of bringing somebody who's disincarnate back into physical existence without connecting them with their previous body.
What I wonder is... Go ahead, Chris.
Even like a servitor or egregore, that's only temporary. I mean, it doesn't last forever. I mean, you put it into service, it does what it has to do, and then it dissipates. To stay living, for lack of a better term, I can't think of anything that does that as far as a religion or a practice.
Well, this is an experiment that has been going on for, I would say, about 12 years now. And as I participate further in it, I will be given an opportunity to talk a little bit more openly about it and show some images and this kind of thing. But I bring it up here, and I had really not intended to bring it up, but as we talk about energy and how energy transforms from one thing to another, and last week we talked about shape-shifting, and, sorcery does not happen compartmentalized. It happens across the broad spectrum of that which we are existing in. And there is no way to draw the line and say, well, tonight we're only going to talk about this. It's not really how it works. Because people come to me often to talk to me about corporal necromancy. People who are dying say to me, I know that you have some experience in this. Can you reanimate me, per se? So there are so many areas. There are so many gray areas in the experience of necromancy and dealing with the dead. What I'm doing here is coming to an area where I want to talk about what it means to be dead. Because if we're going to talk about matter and all of this and that, then let's talk about what happens. Where does this come from? I don't accept the term soul, having been brought up Catholic. It is something that I never really grasped in that way because it always seemed connected to religion in some way. So I don't use that word. I will say that someone has an essence, an entity, a complete package of self, per se, and that when they die, they become more of that self. And I've said that enough times for everyone to know that's my position. So going back to the very beginning of this show, what happens when we die? Why are some of them visible and some of them not? Sometimes someone comes to me and they're sure they've heard that person, they've seen that person, and I can't pull them through. Because if you meet someone who says they can talk to absolutely any individual who's disincarnate at any time, you're talking to a fraud. Because the disincarnate are people who used to be alive, and some of them didn't want to talk to this individual when they were alive, so why would they want to talk to this individual now? We must remember we're talking about disincarnate and not demons. They come with a life experience, and that life experience is just growing in a broader way now that they can act without boundaries, act without any kind of excuses to not take a look and see what's happening. So do either of you have experience with clients who come to you and say, I've heard this individual, or I know this person wants to talk to me, or have you had experiences where there's a disincarnate that you're desperate to talk to and have not been able to? Thoughts?
Yes, I have. When I first started out, exploring this field, I definitely tried to contact relatives who didn't seem inclined to want to talk to me, and we had gotten along just fine in life. It wasn't as if there was any sort of bitterness. And there are still a few that I can't contact for some reason, and maybe they've just decided they don't want to have that sort of interaction. I can't really tell. But I have also had people come to me and insist, oh my gosh, my dead husband who died 10 years ago just appeared to me the other night, and he was there in my bed, and I didn't know what to do, but he was definitely there. It's sometimes hard for me to not immediately jump into, well, this could easily have been a dream. I don't want to discourage them from thinking what they're thinking, and I don't want to poo-poo them. But unless I can, usually it's just one experience for me. It's not a repeat of constantly revisiting. I kind of need to have the repetition of an experience if someone is telling me about it, for me to give it any credence. The one-offs make me think mostly it's their imagination. It might not be, but somehow they seem to, if I approach it that way, they somehow seem to be a little more calm about it and say, okay, it probably wasn't. I've only had a few people come to me to say, no, this has been going on for months and it always is distracting, or there's something that's not dreamlike about it. And it often happens when they're awake anyway, so, I wouldn't even say that they're hallucinating.
When I lived in Manhattan the last time, I had a client come to me. She had made 3 or 4 appointments and canceled each time, and it just seemed to be what she was doing. And I said to her, I think we should stop trying to do this. It's not going to work. She said, no, I absolutely have to come because he's talking to me constantly, and he will not shut up, and he's just driving me crazy. And I said, who? And she said, well, you're the necromancer, you tell me. And a lot of people approach it that way. So she comes to my space, and we sit and we start to talk, and she tells me who the disincarnate is, and I can see that he's there. I can see the outline of him. He occasionally comes in a little bit more full as we are spending time together, and I asked him a question. He said, I don't like you. I'm not going to talk to you. I don't like what you do. I think what you do is awful. People should let the dead be dead. And I was about to tell her what he said, and she said, I don't know why he keeps saying let the dead be dead when he is the one who keeps contacting me. So she was hearing the same person I was say the same thing, but he chose not to speak to me because he felt that what I do is inappropriate and leads people into sadness. So that was one of the more, I know something cannot be more unique, but for want of another word, truly unique situation where I had somebody standing right in front of me who wanted so badly to talk to her and didn't want to talk to me. So I said to her, so why are you here? If you can talk to him directly, why are you here? And she said, because he lies. And I wanted you to be able to tell me if he's telling me the truth or not. So I spent a lot of time with them, and eventually I actually read him the way I do a reading for the living, and read his experience as a disincarnate, which is not done that often. It doesn't really come up. And I don't read people against their will without their knowledge of that unless they're doing something inappropriate and I need an in. So I was actually doing a necromancy session where the task was to do a reading on the disincarnate. So my question is, do you come across people who you can see who don't want to talk to you? Chris, have you had any of those experiences?
Oh, yeah. I had the one garage I worked at, especially when I was there alone at night, I would see this guy that was standing in what was our lunchroom. And you got to remember the land that this was built on was farmland at one time, so you never know what was there. And I knew he was there. I could see him. And I would ask him what he wanted. He wouldn't say anything. He wouldn't talk to me. And this went on and on almost for the whole time that I was there. He just stood in the lunchroom, because we had a big plate glass window there, and he would just look out into the shop. Now, I have my own opinions of what he was. I kind of think at one time he owned the land, and he was just there to see what was going on, you know. He might not have been able to understand me, because with the history of the land that was around there, he would either been German or Pennsylvania Dutch.
Chris, in that situation, were other people seeing him?
No, I was the only one that saw him.
And could you hear him?
Nope, he wouldn't talk to me. I said I was the only one that would see him. It was when I was there alone, which Friday night and Saturday morning I was always there by myself. And that was the only time that he would come.
I heard you say he wouldn't talk to you, but was he talking at all? Because I'm always interested in these gray areas with people who are experiencing this kind of ability in necromancy, because there are times where, you know, when I'm at the studio or I'm in places where people worked in groups in a period of time where even children were working, this kind of thing. I see groups like that often, and they're talking amongst themselves, but not to me. So this is another area. I mean, this is an area we haven't even touched, which I'm greatly interested in, which is the Disincarnate, who are almost like they're in another place, and they don't see me, but I know that I can see them, and I know that I can hear them. And it's almost like eavesdropping. They're going on with the conversation. When we were in upstate New York a couple of years ago for a little while, there were two people who fought constantly in one of the rooms in the house. And I saw them, and I heard them, and I knew that they were in this ongoing loop, this constant loop of fighting about exactly the same thing over and over and over again. But they did not see me, which I find that to be extraordinarily intriguing. And I chose not to break into that, because I felt that if I had, one of two things would happen. Either they would break out of the loop and there could be chaos for them, or they'd break out of the loop and there could be chaos for me and my family in that house. So I felt that not interrupting that was a good thing. Have either of you experienced, or Chris, you were talking about this one discarnate, you were saying, could he see you? Did he know you could see him?
He would look in my direction. Now, if, as far as him seeing me, I don't know, because he wouldn't talk to me. He would look, and you could tell, because he would watch, and if I walked by, his head would turn. But he wouldn't talk to me, even though I would talk to him, and I would stand like right in front of him, and I would talk to him. He wouldn't talk to me. He would look at me, his lips wouldn't move, but I knew he could see me. Where you see that a lot here is at Gettysburg, where the battlefield is, and they're almost in a constant loop. And it seems like they're oblivious to the people that are around them. Because you got to remember, there's tourists there constantly.
Yeah.
I mean, even in the middle of winter, it is constantly people. And that is played over and over and over again. And it's the same people, and people tell you the same stories, and you can hear them talking, you can hear the battle, you can hear the people giving orders and things like that, and they don't know I shouldn't say they don't know you're there. They don't acknowledge you being there. And I mean, you can walk right through where it's going on, and it don't stop.
Morgan?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and ask you, because there is this whole thing in the, new paranormal community. There's active hauntings and residual hauntings. And I wonder if there is some basis for this in some sort of energy pattern that's there, where maybe people are not actually seeing disincarnate, but somehow the disincarnate, the action that happened when they were dying, somehow has imprinted itself in a way that people are able to see it, and so it really is like a loop. It is not actually disincarnate people who are there. Is it possible that this is just some sort of energy pattern that we as humans are perceiving as real people when in fact it's just an echo of something that happened back during the Battle of Gettysburg?
Yeah, I think that's very, very interesting, and I think that's possible. I think that, my theory on how demons are created, that they are an amalgam of chaotic energy, difficult to understand energy, this kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think that situations create these imprints, such as battlefields, this kind of thing, where if you look at the human life, the idea of being on a battlefield, being attacked by people and killing other people is so odd. It's not like something that most people have the experience of in their life, and it's not a natural part of the human experience. I mean, some may argue that it is, but in the life that we lead in this year and this time and this place, it is not really what we experience, generally speaking, in the human experience. So the idea that this thing happened, that one has been dropped into this odd reality where, you've got to kill the guy next to you or he's going to kill you, creates a similar thing to what a demon creates. It creates this released amalgam of craziness, of odd energy outside the human experience, yet the human beings involved have been forced into this action, so they're so far out of their usual way of being in their world, and yet they are in this important moment, important because it's changing something about them. I think these little, if you will, videos of an experience go on, because I think that when all of this is going on and we can't interact with it, that it is a clip, if you will, like a video clip, and not the disincarnate standing in front of us. And again, this show always brings up stuff nobody talks about, and this is something that I think that is valuable and not really looked at. And you're saying that this is something that the new paranormal community is talking about?
Yeah, they make a distinction between active hauntings where the disincarnate is somehow interacting with the paranormal investigators or with a family, and then a residual haunting is something where you see what you believe to be an apparition of a deceased person, and they're doing something, but they're paying absolutely no attention to you. And very frequently what it is it's the same person doing the same thing over and over and over again. They're standing at a window, they're pacing a hall or something. And this is reported. A lot of European haunting stories have to do with the restless ghosts that are always pacing the hall and can never be consoled. Right. And it's probably because they're not actually there and can't interact to be consoled.
I'll tell you that I grew up in a house that was so heavily inhabited by demons and very angry, hostile, disincarnate, that it was very difficult to be a child in that experience. I was not the only one who saw them. It wasn't that kind of thing. And there were two individuals who were living or being in the room that I slept in, the first room that I slept in. And I cannot tell you how many nights I woke up screaming on the floor of the closet, even when I was very little, over and over, screaming the same phrases, which I'm not really interested in repeating on the radio, because of the disincarnate involved and their request for privacy and this kind of thing, over and over and over again, living this scenario, being pulled into their loop over and over and over, and feeling that I was sort of walking through, as I thought about it later in my life, walking into someone's ongoing constant loop of a video, and that somehow I was the player that got to come in and out of it. And in that same room was a disincarnate who was incredibly hostile and angry and used to, physically hurt me and yell at me and say, you have to be part of it. I brought you here to be part of it. And this would go on all the time. That room in that house, that story went on whether I was in it or not. So I think I was actually in a situation where both those things were happening at the same time, and that they were interplaying. An active disincarnate was playing into this ongoing loop. I would not use the word residual, because that to me would mean that the action occurred absolutely in that place and it's non-negotiable, and that this is a holdover effect. I'm not sure that what was happening in that room over and over again happened in that place. I don't have absolute evidence of that. But I will say that there was an item in that room, a doll similar to the doll I have now, that I felt brought this into the place. So, yes, I think that those things can happen at the same time. Do we have any comments that we want to bring into this from the chat room?
Yeah, there was one question, and Darren has been very patient about this because he asked it a while ago. I was waiting for a place to slip it in. And he was asking, and we had talked about this a little bit, why some people can see the disincarnate and others do not. Is it because some people are just not paying attention? And I would like to bring in my personal theories on this, is that I think that some of us are hardwired to actually be able to see the disincarnate from birth. Some of us have this gift. And I think anybody can have it, and your brain can probably be rewired, possibly through the use of magnetic fields. And if we have a little bit of time, I could discuss what I think about that. But I really do think that among people who are born with this or have the gift to be able to do this as you do, Sorceress, if you took a genetic test of these people and you isolated their genes, you would find among people who can naturally see the disincarnate without any sort of training or any sort of experience to have to initiate them into this, I think you would find genetic markers that were in all of these people, whether it's a specific gene, a mutation, or a variant of the gene. I think you would find this. I think there might be a real physical mechanism there for why some people can just perceive the dead and other people need something such as an external stimulation to be able to do it.
I think that you're right. I think both of those things are happening at the same time. People say to me all the time, oh, I know anyone can do it, but I'll never do it like you. And I'll say, no, not anyone can do it. Many people can do it, but not everyone can do it. Because not everyone is built with the ability to handle what occurs when you have this kind of a life where you can see the dead and hear them all the time. But I agree with you that I think there are some genetic, let's just say, factors here. And if you look at the upbringing of people from culture to culture and what they experience, there are cultures that are naturally comfortable with or at least involved with, the concept of the disincarnate on a regular basis, and there are cultures that are much more sterile in this way. And people who are born into the cultures that are much more sterile are much less likely to have the early life honing that is helpful when it comes to being able to do necromancy. Those of us who are born into cultures where blood and death and all this kind of thing are just part of the day-to-day of how it is, have had the opportunity to be more involved with and open to these things. But yes, Morgan, I do agree with you that there is probably some kind of genetic difference between myself and somebody who the idea of even seeing the dead is horrifying to them. There has to be. My life is so completely different than almost anyone that I know in this way, that there absolutely has to be some kind of difference between myself and most of the other people who cannot see the dead. I think it's more than choosing not to see the dead. And yes, there are definitely techniques and external simulation, as you had talked about, that can help. We do a thing called the connectors, which is a group of sigils we use, which are triggers to opening up this kind of portal. And a lot of my students have done it. One of them is doing it right now, and that's been very useful. But if she came to me with no basic ability, I wouldn't have even suggested that she use the connectors. So I feel there has to be some sort of natural presence available within the individual. What do you think about that, Chris?
Oh, I agree. I mean, I don't know why that we're wired the way we are, but there has to be an opening there in the first place. I mean, something had to trigger our ability to do that. Whether, it's the same thing as the reason some of us are left-handed, the reason that we have blonde hair, blue eyes, whatever. There has to be a reason that we can do this, like right away. You have other traditions. A lot of the hoodoo tradition talks about being born with a cull over your face. That's like an automatic an automatic indication that you're going to be able to see things that aren't there to most people. Mm-hmm. So there's basis in other cultures for there being a difference amongst people like us. That there's something genetic that we're born into this. Some say it's passed down through generations.
Well, in Sicilian culture, that call is also a very big deal. We talk about that too. It's actually, I cannot believe as I look at the clock, 5 minutes till the show is over. This has flown by, and I feel like I'm sitting in my living room with two great minds, and we're sitting together and having this wonderful experience, this exchange, connecting this rather emotional work to science. And I must say that in this 2 hours, the respect for the Disincarnate has been enormous, and about that I'm grateful. So let's do a quick round robin about how people can contact us and say a little bit about the work that you do so people know how to find us. Morgan, you want to give it a start?
Sure. My full name is Morgan St. Knight, and you can reach me at Morgan St. Knight, all one word, at hotmail.com. And you can also find me on Facebook. And a lot of the work that I do really is an individual sort of work. So if a person comes to me with any sort of problem or experience that they need to talk about, I'm willing to approach it on any number of levels and try to find a happy medium for us to be comfortable with whatever needs to be done for that person, for their benefit and for their safety.
Thank you, Morgan. And Morgan is also an author. Morgan, name of the book, please?
The name of the book is Curse of Prometheus, A Tale of Medea, and there is actually a webpage called Tales of Medea where you can find information about the book and where to buy it.
Thank you. And if ever you can't figure that out or you can't find Morgan, you can find me, and I'll point you right towards Morgan. Chris, how to find you?
You can find me on my email through HELS, rogue @gmail.com. You can also find me on Hell's Rogue on my Facebook page. And my work is primarily in the healing and the powwow medicine for the Pennsylvania Dutch and numerous things like that.
Thank you, Chris. And again, if you can't find Chris, you can always find Chris through me. We will soon have a separate website just for the Dark Matters radio show, which Morgan is developing for us, and that will be an excellent portal to be able to communicate with any of us. And I'm the Sorceress Cagliastro. The easiest way to find me is sorceresscagliastro@gmail.com. I leave that simple email out there so that I can be found. The website is cagliastrotheironring.com or Cagliastro Studios in the Hands of Nine, studiointhehandsofnine.com, or on Facebook, also obviously through Blog Talk Radio. I want to thank my co-host, Chris Ostrowski, for bringing an incredible history, amazing work that he's done to this experience. And, thank you. It's an honor to be working with you, Chris. And Morgan St. Knight, amazing author, who came to this radio show at my request and brought this wonderful scientific edge to the work, which only allows us to create a broader experience and offer more information to a greater audience. I'm the Sorceress Cagliastro, Blood Sorceress, Necromancer in the Hands of Nine. My books can be found on Amazon.com. Just put in Cagliastro. Some of them are The Sorceress, some of them are Sorceress. So if you want to find them all, Sorceress, Cagliastro, just put in Cagliastro at Amazon.com, keyword Cagliastro. If you want to learn about my work, that's the way to do it, and you can also talk to me about classes. Thank you, everyone. This has been a great show. Good night.
Good night, Sorceress.
Good night.
Good night.